and it'll be fine. They said over and over they weren't looking to cut personnel."
Lee shifted until he was lying on his side, resting his head on his hand. "You believe them? We're doing this to cut costs, and with fewer companies, they won't need as many firefighters. They'll cut positions, maybe not right away, but you know that's what they'll do. And I'm one of the newest hires, so that means they'll cut me. I worked hard to get this job, and I'm good at it. I put my life in danger every day, and more often than not, I'm the one they send into the burning buildings like today. But I'm the one who's going to pay the price if they close the station." Lee could feel the tension he'd worked off earlier already beginning to return. "You know that, Dirk." Lee saw Dirk's eyes darken, and then he sighed loudly.
"I suppose you may be right, but there's nothing we can do about it."
Dirk tugged him closer.
"We'll figure it out when it happens, but we can't do anything right now. So go to sleep."
Dirk wrapped his arms around Lee's chest after he'd settled on the bed. Lee knew Dirk was at least partially right. They might not be able to do anything about it tonight, but he wasn't giving up a job he loved without a fight. Ideas flew through his head as Lee closed his eyes and tried to sleep. But even with Dirk holding him, he found it difficult to turn off his thoughts. Chapter 2. The mood at the station hadn't improved much over the last 2 days. Most guys still did their jobs, but quietly. When they did talk, they grumbled and sometimes snapped at each other. Some of the men, however, talked incessantly about what they thought might happen, spreading gloom and doom with each breath. Lee was tiring of it quickly and had joined the quiet group, trying to keep doing his job, which right now included painting the stairwell from the engine garage to the living quarters. He was making good progress and figured he'd be done in an hour, provided no one stuck their hand on the fresh paint again. "Looking good, Lee," one of the guys said as he passed without stopping to talk, and Lee barely looked up from his work. He needed to get this done. Lee put the last roll of white paint on the wall and gathered his supplies before heading to the cleaning sink to rinse out the brushes and roller and hang them to dry. There were 3 or 4 brushes that had already been cleaned and left to drip dry. Everywhere he went in the building, the room smelled of paint. They'd found they didn't have much in their maintenance budget, but the captains had figured out what projects might make the most impact for the money. If nothing else, it would show anyone who walked through the station that the men cared about the place where they worked.
"All finished?"
Dirk asked from behind him.
"Captain wants everyone upstairs for a meeting."
"I was wondering what you were doing here," Lee said. Dirk wasn't on shift today, and Lee hadn't been expecting to see him. He followed Dirk upstairs and saw that most of the men from across the shifts had gathered. Lee wondered how he'd missed the meeting notice and checked the board. There it was, plain as day. "Okay," Captain Morris began. "As all of you know, the station is up for closure and consolidation into the other 2 companies. I talked to some borough council members, and they don't want to close us. We're the oldest fire company in town and one of the oldest in the state, maybe even the country. But our facilities are in need of renovation, and the council can't afford it. Now, Goodwill is also under consideration, and they have their own problems." "So there's hope," Lee said. "Yes and no," Captain Morris answered. "We've done some figuring, and we need a new roof, kitchen, baths, and general building maintenance, including brickwork. Our estimate in the kitchen is $30,000, the bath area is $40,000, the roof $25,000, and the other work an additional $20,000. As the numbers were read off, Lee could see the faces of the others in the room falling like a wedding cake in the July sun. "So to be safe, we need $150,000, because once we start a project, there will be hidden costs." "Looks like more chicken dinners," Steve Granger said from where he sat across from Lee. "The next one is scheduled for 6 weeks, so we'll be able to get started." "How much did the last one make?" Lee asked, and Steve looked to the captain. "About $5,000, Captain Morris answered, "which isn't bad, but in order to pay for this, we need to hold 30 of them. Now, the good news is that we don't need to have all the money at once, because we aren't going to be able to do all these projects at the same time. The roof needs to be done first, and then the bath areas. We can paint and work on the kitchen to get us through a little while longer.
So what's the bottom line, Cap?
Dirk asked from next to Lee. Captain Morris cleared his throat.
I figure we need to raise between $50,000 and $60,000 to show the council we're serious and that we have the capability to get the rest of the money over time. If we do that, they'll probably keep us open and look at consolidating Goodwill. We also need to increase capacity for additional firefighters because if they do close Goodwill, we will need to absorb some of their equipment and men. We can do that. There's physical room here. We just need to get our facilities in better repair.
Captain Carter joined Captain Morris, the two of them standing next to one another.
We need ideas for raising money, but we both agree we don't want to turn this into a fire station-shaped begging bowl. And there will not be a stupid thermometer sign on the lawn. If we decide to try to do this, we're going to do it right.
Yes, Captain Carter echoed.
So what kinds of ideas do you have?
All the men looked at one another, shaking their heads.
What we've been doing brings in a steady amount of money, but we need to do things differently and shake things up, because we aren't going to raise this kind of money selling chicken dinners the way we have.
The captain looked as frustrated as everyone else in the room appeared to be.
We need to figure out what we're going to do, and we need to come up with a plan fast. We'll have another meeting on Friday, and we need to present and discuss all ideas. If you don't feel comfortable bringing it up in front of the group, give it to Morris or myself, and we'll present the idea.
The two captains left the room, and everyone looked around, but no one seemed to have anything to say. The people from the other shifts left, talking quietly with each other. Lee looked at Dirk, who shrugged and gazed back at him blankly.
You got any ideas?
Dirk asked, and Lee shook his head with a soft sigh.
Me neither,
Dirk added.
I checked the schedule, and we're both on tomorrow.
Then he leaned closer so the others couldn't hear.
Why don't you come by tonight?
Lee nodded slowly, his mind still churning over the fundraising issue, trying to find an answer.
You don't have to,
Dirk said when Lee didn't answer. Lee rolled his eyes. Dirk put up a big, hard front, but underneath, way underneath, he was a pussycat whose feelings got hurt more easily than Lee would expect. Just thinking, I wasn't saying no. I'll see you after my shift ends.
Maybe we can throw around some ideas if you want,
Dirk offered, and Lee smirked. Lee peered around the room, thankful no one was paying them any mind. If we're at your house, there are definitely other things I'd rather be throwing around, Lee told Dirk with a grin. That earned him a chuckle.
Then I'll see you after your shift, caveman.
Dirk stood up and left the room. Lee had to keep himself from following him with his eyes. Instead, Lee listened to the other guys talking and throwing around ideas among themselves. None of them seemed to pan out for one reason or another.
It's a lot of money in just a few months,
Carl Peterson said. He was one of the old-timers, and he could usually be counted on to be the voice of pessimism in the group. That may be, but it's not impossible, Lee said. Since we already have the chicken dinner planned, how can we maximize it? We'll have a lot of people showing up because we always do. I keep asking myself how we can capitalize on the traffic. Lee let his thought trail off.
We could put together a flyer explaining what we're doing and ask for donations. We usually put out a jar and get some anyway,
Steve said.
I think I can do that,
Davy volunteered.
I'll get something written up and pass it to the captain before the meeting.
He left the group, and Lee could almost picture him hurrying to the computer he always brought with him to work. I was also thinking we might offer more than just chicken. We cook it and people take it to go. Why not prepare sides and sell them too? Lee asked, and others nodded. That helps, but it doesn't bring in more people, and that's what we need to do, Lee commented, still thinking about a way to draw more people, but nothing came to mind. The small group talked for a while longer, deciding nothing, and Lee excused himself. He had chores to do, so did the rest of them, for that matter. The following morning, Lee and Dirk rode in together. This was becoming normal when they spent the night together. They just arrived and clocked in when the alarm sounded, so they dashed into their gear and were on the truck before Lee could give anything much thought. It was a bad one. An old, abandoned factory outside town had caught fire, and the building was nearly fully engulfed by the time they arrived. Since it was abandoned, they weren't concerned about anyone being inside, but as they poured water on the blaze, explosions rocked the building, and everyone was called back as black, caustic smoke billowed out of the building. "Evacuate the area and get any civilians out of here," came through the radio, and the trucks and all personnel backed away.
Do we know what's in there?
Dirk asked from beside Lee once everyone was out of safe distance.
Could be anything.
Captain Morris answered before getting on the radio to call for backup and help evacuating the area. All they could do was let the building burn and keep the fire from spreading. It wasn't worth anyone getting injured. The surrounding buildings were sprayed as long as they could remain upwind and out of the smoke, and after a few hours, the fire began to burn itself out. By the time they returned to the station, everyone was sweaty and stank from God knows what. Lee went up to the bunk area, got his bag, and carried it to the showers. Other guys were doing the same. Lee got into one of the shower stalls and closed the door before getting undressed. He took a quick shower since there were others who needed to use it as well, and after dressing, he cleaned the shower for the next person and walked out. The sight that greeted him practically knocked his socks off. Dirk stood outside the door wearing only what looked like a pair of fire pants. They hung around his hips with just a single suspender holding them up. Others milled around waiting their turn, but Lee couldn't take his eyes off Dirk. He had this urge to pull him into the shower stall and strip off those pants to see just what he had on under them. Lee's cock liked the idea as well, because it throbbed and jumped in his now tight pants. Damn, the man looked amazing. Large arms and a full chest, with cut abs that disappeared into those fire pants, and the way the suspender fell over Dirk's nipple made Lee want to reach out and touch it to see if he could make Dirk squirm. Of course, he didn't, and instead he moved out of the room and let Dirk clean up, but the image stayed with him. Maybe he'd asked Dirk to bring his fire pants home once. Lee finished dressing in the bunk area as other men came and went, waiting their turn to clean up. During that shift alone, they got 3 more calls and spent much of the day away from the station, catching a quick bite when they returned, only to be called out once again a few minutes later. The summer heat was building, drying out grass and woodlands. At the end of the shift, Lee had a chance to sit down and relax with a huge bottle of frigid water that felt like the nectar of the gods. No one had had a chance to talk about fundraising plans, but an idea was forming in the back of Lee's mind. He wanted to run it by Dirk, though, before he said anything to anyone else. Finally, their shift was over, and Lee rode back to Dirk's house. They hadn't talked about what was happening, but as soon as Lee stepped into Dirk's living room, the man was all over him.
I kept thinking about you in that shower.